Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you're enjoying these episodes, and I hope you're doing well. My guest today is Frederik Logevall. He is the recent winner of the Pulitzer Prize. You may have heard of that award for his book Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam. He is a foremost expert on the Vietnam War as an American historian. His book Choosing War was hugely influential in my own thinking about how the United States got involved in the war. He's just an incredible authority, and it was wonderful to be able to sit down and talk with him at the American Historical Association's annual conference in New York last month. He was kind enough to sit down with me and talk for an hour about Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon and all the other figures that got us involved in this house of horrors, I think, as I describe it. We also talk about my time, or his time, at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which overlapped a little bit during the 1990s. And we just had a great talk about Vietnam. It was incredible to be able to hear him talk about his years of research. He's been involved in kind of looking at the years leading into this war for a long time, and his work has revealed, I think, some really disturbing things about American politics, about American history, and about the way that war is waged in this country. So really great stuff. I hope you enjoy this episode. You can find more on iTunes. You can go to nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com and find all the episodes. They are all on Stitcher.com. And then you can like the Facebook page and get updates on new episodes and all sorts of other stuff. Thanks so much for listening. This is me talking to Professor Frederik Logevall.
Basically about to start high school.
Mm-hmm.
We emigrated I did a little bit of elementary school, but basically high school. We emigrated to Vancouver, Canada. Had an interest in international affairs. Automatically, therefore, I guess you could say I was interested in the United States as the big superpower. And read as an undergraduate in Canada David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest. And the book had a powerful effect on me. It was a complete page-turner for me, and I was hooked. And it also, however, caused me to say, and I think there's a bit of a lag, but sometime after reading the book, I thought, I want to know more about this.
Yeah.
And I knew enough from my undergraduate studies to know that, roughly speaking, one could expect 30 years after the events in question that a lot of archives would open up. So I thought, or 25 to 30. So I thought, my timing is pretty good for this. And so it began in a serious way with a PhD dissertation that then became my first book, Choosing War.
Yeah.
And that's focused on Kennedy and Johnson and the so-called Americanization of the war in 63, 64, and 65. And I thought that would be a one-off. I thought, you know what? I'll get this book out of the way. Boom. Move on to something else. I was going to write a book about Walter Lippmann and the Cold War. But something happens to many of us who work on Vietnam. I just felt compelled to continue, and here we are.
To go back to you being younger, what was the Vietnam War when you were a child, or when you were coming of age as a teenager? What was the Vietnam War to you? Did it exist at all in your consciousness?
Not really. I'm too young to have any real direct memory at all of the war. I do have the vaguest of memories that in Sweden, where we lived in central Sweden outside Stockholm, that some of the debates that went on, obviously not only went on, but that raged in this country, in the United States, went on also there, that parents and their kids would disagree about the war. The Swedish government, and I didn't know this at the time, but the Swedish government was the first Western country to extend recognition to Hanoi.
Oh, wow.
So the Social Democratic government in Stockholm did that much to the consternation of the United States. And so the war was part of Swedish political culture. And in fact, it's a great demonstration of the global nature of this conflict. That little neutral Sweden, tucked away in the northern part of Europe, would be roiled by some of the same controversies and schisms that you see, obviously, in this country. And so, but I don't really have memories of this. And, I graduated high school in the early 80s. And so, for me, it's always been a subject that I've studied much more from a historical perspective than anything else.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about the young people in Sweden kind of having a particular attitude about the war. It seems like the war became a stand-in for a whole lot of different things going on around the world at the time. Like, when you think about like the Prague Spring, it seems like the Vietnam War is just a kind of almost like a lightning rod for kind of bringing together a lot of issues that are agitating radicals all around the world during that era, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I don't think there's any question that it, I was going to say served that function, but that might not be the right phrase. But that, no question, it had a kind of transformative effect, or helped certainly generate a great deal of unrest on the part of students. It wasn't the only thing in the Swedish case or the French case or other instances we could talk about. It wasn't the only thing that drove the student movement, but no question that it contributed.
I wonder if you could talk just a minute about what it was specifically about Halberstam's work, because I teach the Vietnam War sometimes, and when I do, I often use his. He has a short biography of Ho.
He does.
That is really useful for, and for me, what I like about that book is it kind of, it intimates and suggests so much of what went on before, and it makes you want to know more about what went on before. Is that kind of what happened?
Well, it is. I mean, the little Ho book, which I too have used in class.
Yeah.
And which a lot of professional historians now, I'm guessing, would be quick to castigate. Just because it's both it's thin, it's weakly sourced, it's not based on a lot of research by Halberstam, but it's nevertheless a very powerful book, as you suggest. Best and the Brightest is a very different beast, because it's a big, sprawling, arguably overwritten book in some ways, but I think immensely powerful. And Halberstam had a particular talent, it seems to me, for making the principal players, in this case, really key advisors around Kennedy and Johnson, and then the two presidents themselves, but making them really come alive.
Yeah.
And you want to learn more about them. You want to have a better sense than he's even giving you about what makes them tick, what's the nature of the domestic political debate surrounding the decisions to Americanize the war. For me, he also demonstrated in that book something that he fleshed out in more detail, I think, in his Korean War book, which is the close connection between domestic politics and foreign policy. And I think Halberstam is exactly right in suggesting, at least indirectly in The Best and the Brightest, that you can't understand the war. You can't understand the decision by Johnson in particular to embark on an ultimately, I think, disastrous escalation of the war if you don't pay close attention to the domestic political context in which he made that decision. His reading of the domestic political stakes, his fear of, if you will, the ghost of McCarthy, and the Democrats in particular, felt vulnerable, as you know, in this part of the Cold War, felt vulnerable to charges that they were soft on communism if they didn't stand firm. I think Halberstam was wholly right to draw our attention to that.
Yeah, it's something that I noticed more as I researched the run-up to the war, that something that doesn't maybe it is covered a lot, but I never really made the connection between the Gulf of Tonkin incident and resolution and the fact that it was in an approaching election.
Oh, yeah.
And that it's, for me, I think, and many historians and many people that just know a little bit about the run-up to the war, they feel like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is just this, this set of lies that was made because Johnson was desperate to go to war. But it seems like in that domestic political context, it seems like what you're saying is that Johnson made the decision in part from fear of being soft on communism and fear of that kind of that domestic political situation. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think I don't think I would disagree with anything you've said, and I think we now have, ample evidence to suggest that though the vote in Congress, in the House and in the Senate, was essentially unanimous, it was an overwhelming show of support for the president in getting this resolution, as you point out. It's clear now that those figures, that tally, hides the fact that there was privately a great deal of skepticism on the part of especially Senate Democrats, and this is something that I flesh out in my first book, Choosing War, and that was a great surprise to me in my research that that misgivings were deeply felt, and yet, as you point out, it's an election year. Lawmakers, by and large, are not willing to go against the president at a time when Americans are out there being shot at. And Johnson, who was very clever about this, understood that he was putting, especially his own party, in a very difficult position if they were going to vote against him. And I think he did fear for his political future, should he be perceived as not standing up to the communists. An interesting question then is, was he correct in his fear? And I suspect that I suspect he was not. That he had more maneuverability than he himself believed, and this becomes, I think, especially the case after his demolishing of Barry Goldwater in that general election. And there's a very interesting memo that Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, writes to Johnson in mid-February 1965, which is a crucial period, as you know, in the decision-making. Yeah. Humphrey, in effect, says to the president, don't do this. This is 1965 is a year of minimum political risk for this administration. We don't have to worry about the Republicans. We don't have to worry about the right wing. Moreover, if you do this, if you go to war, there's going to be a huge price to pay, not least for this party, for the Democratic Party. Humphrey's memo, which I use in class, really bears paying close attention to, because it comes at this key moment. Yeah, is really, I think, in many respects, spot on. But of course, Johnson didn't. Johnson waved it aside. Yeah. I mean, Humphreys wrote a few letters like that that were fiercely critical of the policy over the years, didn't he? Yeah, or he was. I would put it like this: he wrote a few missives that expressed his concerns. Johnson reportedly said, I don't think we have proof of this, but Johnson said, Hubert, we don't need all these memos. And made very clear how he felt about Humphrey's efforts. And not long thereafter, perhaps immediately thereafter, Humphrey stopped penning these memos to the president. He understood that this wasn't going to go anywhere. And then, of course, the tragedy with Humphrey is that he becomes a cheerleader. Yeah. He becomes very supportive of the policy until very late, I think, in the 1968 campaign when he's the nominee. Shifts at a late moment, arguably just a little bit too late, and loses that election.
It reminds me of, one of the most famous or infamous sections of the Pentagon Papers has a kind of breakdown of why the United States is still fighting in Vietnam, and one of them is, I think, the 70% to avoid a humiliating defeat. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that goes hand in hand with the things you're telling me about LBJ's personality. How much I guess weight do you put on LBJ's personality as the engine of historical events in Vietnam?
I think that LBJ's personality is important. I mean, one of the things we do as historians is we try to weigh structural causes against more contingent causes, or we try to differentiate between short-term causes and long-term causes, and the role of human agency in history. And the Vietnam case is an interesting one in this regard, because I think monocausal history is seldom satisfactory history, and I think this is a case where that's certainly true. By which I mean that I would not personally want to say that this is all about Lyndon Johnson, and it's all about Lyndon Johnson's personal foibles. It's all about his insecurities and so forth, because there is a permissive context that allows this decision to go forth. He is certainly being encouraged to escalate the war by his advisors. There's bureaucratic momentum. There's the mere fact that the United States has been heavily involved in Vietnam by now for some 15 years in a serious way by the time he makes this decision. So all of those things matter. But I still think that Johnson, and the fact that it's Lyndon Johnson in the White House in the first 6 months of 1965, is of great importance. So thinking counterfactually, a different president, including, I would suggest, even John F. Kennedy, might well have chosen differently and avoided the kind of large-scale expansion of the U.S. commitment that Johnson embarked on. I think it has a lot to do with Johnson's sense of the stakes. It has something to do with his insecurities when it came to especially foreign policy decisions. And if we construct a kind of causal hierarchy, which I think we have to do as historians, and I tell my students this as well, especially if we're historians of decision-making, if we construct such a causal hierarchy, I think that Johnson, the role that Lyndon Johnson and his assessment of what he had to do, and his assessment of both the stakes and the prospects, has to be, if not right at the top, very near the top.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, and it's hard because so many people, when they talk about this war and they talk about any war, history in general, like tend to locate things in the one man, and the JFK, the particular debate about JFK, I'm not sure how useful it is, because like you're saying, it's counterfactual. Yeah. We don't know what would have happened. No. But the arguments can be made, I think, either way in terms of JFK's kind of commitment to this policy. I know Marilyn Young makes a lot about the 22,000 advisors that were there at the end of his 3 years.
No, and that's important. I mean, I think there's a paradox with Kennedy. I think that he was, from an early point, in fact, from 1951 when he first went to Indochina as a congressman.
Is that the only time? I'm sorry. Do you know? This has been like kind of a subject that's come out. Is that the only time Kennedy went to Vietnam?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
So he went there. He was preparing for a Senate run the next year, and you see him right there in 51 asking very far-sighted, very penetrating questions about whether the French could prevail in Indochina, because at that point you'll remember, the French war is very much still going on. Yeah. In fact, he and Bobby and Patricia, his siblings, can hear gunfire when they're in Saigon that first night. But he asks difficult questions right there about whether France, and by extension any Western power, can prevail in Indochina. I think the doubts that he articulates never really go away. And when he's president for 1,000 days, he draws the line at committing U.S. combat forces. Now, it's true that some of the American advisors are participating in combat. Some of them are being killed. Fair enough. But he does, I think, hold to a certain line. And I think that matters. And Johnson, as we know, was not at all committed to holding to that line. And the other thing that's fascinating about this, and it leads to a very troubling conclusion for me, is that Johnson had his own doubts. In some respects, I think they went as deep as Kennedy's doubts about whether the war was winnable in any meaningful sense, and perhaps more interestingly and more disturbingly, whether it was necessary to try, which is a separate issue. Can we win, and is it important that we try to win? I think Johnson had his own doubts on that score. But as I said, there's a paradox with both men, because they have these doubts. I think they're real and they're deep, and yet they expand American involvement, and we see a steady increase and then a very sharp increase in the level of American commitment under these two men, but especially then in 64 and 65.
If you want to go back to the kind of origins of the Cold War a little bit, I know you studied the Cold War a lot, and in fact, doing a little bit of research on your biography, because part of the show is about biography. I went to UC Santa Barbara, and I was in the history department. I think when you were there, I was there between 96 and 2000.
Of course, yes. I didn't know.
No, and I mean, I was only in history department for about a year. I ended up being a film studies major, and then came back to history as my PhD. But Professor Hasegawa was one of my professors, and Kenneth Osgood was a grad student there, who I have to say, like, Kenneth Osgood was. I was in the honors program, and it was the first time I'd taken an honors class. And I really credit him when I think back at teaching me how to write about history. And I know that you know Kenneth Osgood, right?
So this is, what a small world. So
yeah, it is. I didn't know this connection either.
So Toshi Hasegawa is a very dear friend, and he was a very close colleague of mine. We just were emailing to each other before Christmas. So he and I were close colleagues. We started something together that became while I was still there, the Center for Cold War Studies. So I'm very fond of Toshi, and Ken Osgood was a graduate student at UCSB in the program. I was his principal advisor, so it was just a pleasure and an honor to be able to supervise Ken's dissertation. And I'm not the slightest bit surprised to hear you say that he had a deep influence on you, because Ken Osgood is I think that kind of person. Many students have said something similar regarding his influence, and of course they're both now in the profession. Toshi is still at UC Santa Barbara. Ken is at the Colorado School of Mines. So he's a rare historian in that fine institution, but terrific guys. I had no idea that there was this connection.
Yeah, and me neither, until I started looking at your bio, and I said, "Oh, UCSB," and all that, and I remember waiting for office hours at Ken's office, outside his office, and he had a whole bunch of 1950s Cold War propaganda, and I had not really seen much of that, and it started me looking at Atomic Cafe, and it began a kind of obsession with that world, that creepy kind of 1950s world of Cold War propaganda and stuff about the kind of things that my father told me about, because my dad was someone who got under the school desk and did the duck and cover drills and remembered that kind of environment. I think that when I read your book Embers of War, it brings to mind the idea that the nuclear bomb, how much it loomed over this age. How much did the nuclear bomb overshadow or influence what was happening in Vietnam in that kind of crucial period where the French are being ousted?
It's a very interesting question. By the way, just before I forget, Ken is continuing to work on some of this stuff pertaining to propaganda. In the 50s. At some point, I would encourage you to reconnect with him. He would be delighted, I think, to hear from you, and perhaps even speak with you about this stuff. I think that there's no question that the nuclear dimension matters in the story in a few ways. I mean, most sort of pointedly, I guess I would say, it comes into play in the winter and spring of 1954, as the French are on the ropes in Vietnam, and there's increasing desperation on the part of Paris officials. They ask for American aerial intervention to help save their position in especially in Tonkin, and in particular at Dien Bien Phu. And there is discussion then in the United States, not super directly, but I guess we could say general discussion in the National Security Council and elsewhere about the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. And so it's a kind of live discussion issue on some level. There's not really, that I've found, a smoking gun saying that the United States was prepared to do this at this point in Indochina.
There's that rumored conversation between Dulles and Bidault, right?
Yeah, there's the Bidault-Dulles conversation. I look at that with some care in my book, basically conclude that it's plausible that this conversation took place as the French recalled it. But I don't think it ever it was never close to becoming a reality, because for one thing, the French said, no, we don't want you to do this, because if you kill the Viet Minh divisions, you're also going to kill all the Frenchmen in the valley. So no, thank you. But I think it's worth reflecting on, because I think it does suggest that the United States, and Eisenhower perhaps in particular, was certainly willing to consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons in certain situations. Of course, they no longer had the monopoly, so it had already changed the equation to some extent. What I didn't find, and I had expected to find when I started my research, I didn't find a lot of discussion of the nuclear part of this in the early years. I had thought that I would see more references in the discussions in 49, 50, 51, for example, with respect to Indochina and what one might need to do, especially after Mao and the communists complete their victory in the Chinese Civil War. I didn't see as much of it as I anticipated.
I think it's a moment in your book where the Americans American ambassadors have come to Britain, and they go out to talk to Winston Churchill, and he expresses fears that the U.S. are like opening up some sort of apocalyptic Pandora's box, and it's a really chilling moment that makes me think, maybe it was true that people were looking at the United States as a very dangerous force in the world in the years after World War II, which is kind of a counter reading to how we usually think of the U.S. after World War II.
It's a very astute point, and I do think that the British, and I write about this, as you say, that both Churchill and Eden were fearful of the casual way, let's say, with which the Americans seemed to discuss the possibility of using the nukes, and I think it worried the British greatly. Churchill certainly thought that the British Isles would become sort of ground zero in any kind of nuclear confrontation that might happen. And so this was something that not only the French were concerned about, but the British as well, no question about it.
When you think of the Cold War, and I know it's a big question, but what is the Cold War project to you? Is it a project? Is it primarily of the United States? Is it? Do you take a balanced perspective on that? Because there have been so many schools over the years about what the Cold War actually was. When you think about it, what is it to you?
It's a very good question. I think that, as you know, there's a long-standing debate in the scholarship about whether the Cold War needs to be studied as international history. And if so, how does one go about doing that? I don't have a good answer to that question. One of the points that I make in a book that I co-authored with Campbell Craig called America's Cold War, one of the points we make in the introduction to that book is that writing the Cold War as international history is a very, very difficult undertaking, probably requiring really a team of historians. And so that when people say, it has to be studied as international history or don't do it at all, we basically reject that view in the book. There is every reason to believe, we argue, that it is important to study the Cold War's international history, but also to look at particular countries and their decision-making and why they did what they did or did not do, and in particular the United States. I believe that writing a kind of, if I can call it, U.S.-centric, America-centric international history has something to recommend it, which is to really look closely at what the United States does from the early Cold War right through to the end. Because let's face it, the United States is not merely not merely another player on the international stage. American decisions can have a great influence on what happens elsewhere. That said, I don't think that's enough. That's not all that we should be doing, because it's clear to me that the Cold War in many respects does become a global struggle, and that we need scholars, we need specialists and historians to look at all aspects of the struggle. And of course that includes the Soviets, but also many, many other players on the international stage. I don't know that that's a satisfying answer to your question, but it's a large question, and it's one that I think, as you know, is continuing to generate a lot of debate, needed debate, I would say, in the discipline.
Yeah, I think I asked this question by email of Marilyn Young, and she was kind of responding to some of these ideas, and she was saying that the Cold War, people tend to start their story about the Vietnam War and taking the Cold War's, the landscape of possibilities of the Cold War for granted, it was the Cold War and this is what people had to do. And she's like, it's the Cold War itself that requires explanation and questioning and understanding and kind of figuring out what that project was about. I think that's why, I mean, for me, it can often be like a very simple ideological answer, right? Well, the United States is capitalist and they're going to be the force for capitalism in the world. But that seems too simple, right?
Yeah. No, it does. And I would agree with Marilyn's characterization as you just gave it. And I would then take it in a slightly different direction and say this, that when historians say, as you indicate they do, that the key to understanding Vietnam and the war and U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, the key is understanding the Cold War. That's true to a degree. But I don't think that the evidence shows that Cold War imperatives really drove the big decisions in the early and middle 1960s. Arguably, if you look at the 50s and if you look at Truman's decisions and then Eisenhower's decisions, yes, perhaps you can draw a straight line between Cold War concerns and the superpower struggle and the commitment first to bolstering the French effort, and then after the French are defeated, to try to succeed where the French had failed. I don't think it works by the time we get into 62 and 63 and 64. The reason, I think, is that the Cold War begins to shift, and maybe especially after the missile crisis. And I think that at least behind closed doors, U.S. officials, they see a degree of flexibility, for lack of a better word, that they didn't have before. And I think they understand that one can now prioritize, that there are certain parts of the world that are more important than others, that it's not necessarily a zero-sum game, and that the Cold War consensus, to the extent that it ever really existed, the Cold War consensus is not as powerful as it was before. And so I think, as I've said in various places in print, that I think that it is less a concern about the geopolitical stakes in Vietnam that drives Johnson in 64 and 65, and more a concern with the domestic political imperatives. Yeah. Those themselves can be connected to the Cold War, of course. And to trying to withstand these Republican charges that he thinks are coming. But I don't think it's so much about the superpower confrontation.
It almost seems like LBJ is making a wager that the Vietnam War will give him enough political capital to be able to accomplish what he wants to accomplish at home. Is that your reading of it a little bit?
Yeah, I think
it's almost like if we keep this war, if we keep this, on the back burner and not too much of a disaster, then I'll be able to do what I want with the Great Society. And
I think he did feel that, and again, it raises the question of whether he was correct in that belief. I interviewed McGeorge Bundy many years ago, a few years before his death. And he said something interesting, because I asked him about this, and he said basically this, I'm paraphrasing. He said, had Lyndon Johnson decided that getting out of Vietnam was the right thing to do, Johnson, would have been able to do so in a way that would not have scuttled the Great Society programs, Great Society legislation. So McGeorge Bundy, his own national security advisor, and I think Bundy's correct about this, Bundy was of the view that Johnson could have gotten out and still been able to achieve what he really wanted more than anything else, which was not victory in Vietnam. It was this domestic legislation.
Yeah.
I think that's, as I say, broadly speaking, correct. But I think you're right to say that Johnson didn't see it that way, or at least didn't want to take the risk.
Yeah.
And you can see why he might think, well, look, if I escalate in Vietnam and buy myself some time, and maybe things will go okay in Vietnam, I can have both. I can secure some kind of victory in Vietnam, or at least avoid defeat, while getting the Great Society into place.
And
I think that's what he decided.
Yeah, it's a wager with such disastrous terms.
Well, and here's the thing that I find troubling. That he makes a large-scale war in Vietnam, and sends Americans to fight and die in Vietnam, and of course far more Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians. But a war that, as I suggested earlier, he privately doubts he can win, and even more doubts is that he's far from certain is even necessary to try to win. That's a difficult conclusion that I've reached in the course of my scholarship.
Yeah, and also the fact that this is happening in the context of, I think what Christian Appy points out is arguably the most patriotic generation of young people in American history who are kind of raised in the context of the Cold War. He's got a generation of people at that moment, in '64 at least, ready to make a commitment to whatever the president says.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to me how quickly that changes.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good point. And of course, you could say not only did they come of age in this Cold War, as you say, but a great many of them had fathers who had served in World War II. And to some extent, perhaps uncles or older brothers who had been in Korea. I think that in a sense, many of them now were very ready to answer the call in terms of fighting in Vietnam. But there's no question that this was a generation that was ready to, as you put it, respond to the president.
Yeah.
In a way, whichever way he was choosing to go with this. And that, as you say, begins to shift in short order later.
Yeah, it seems bound up with ideas of authority that start to break apart. And it's interesting to me that LBJ serves as that patriarch that lied to us, and it's interesting also that we remember the presidents in different ways when we think of the Vietnam War. We think of Nixon as kind of the bombing part of the war, right? The Kissinger part of the war, the Cambodia part of the war, and Johnson seems to take the blame for the escalation.
Yeah.
And your work seems to confirm that.
Well, but I think what we should note, however, is that Richard Nixon was right there needling Johnson, egging him on in a certain way. saying in so many words, does Lyndon Johnson have the courage that he needs to have to make sure that the communists don't prevail in Vietnam? So when defenders of Nixon or supporters of Nixon or others who want to at least to some extent exonerate the administration, because after all it was the Democrats who escalated this thing. This was the Democrats' war, the liberals' war.
Yeah.
I think it's worth bearing in mind that Nixon had been strident on Vietnam from the time he was vice president under Eisenhower, and had never really wavered in this commitment to the cause. And in 64 and 65, though he is out of government, is perceived by many observers to still be a prominent Republican.
Yeah.
And he's a hawk. He is completely, it seems to me, at least based on what I've seen, committed to the proposition that the outcome in South Vietnam is of critical importance to American security, and that we're going to hold any Democrat, in particular perhaps, we're going to hold any president who wavers, we're going to hold him responsible.
Yeah. And there's a certain kind of cynicism to all that, of the politics being played around the war. And speaking of cynicism, I mean, how much do you? I'd wonder what you make of J. William Fulbright and his kind of reversal and how quick that reversal was. That just politics? Was there something going on between him and Johnson? I know that they were friends.
Yeah.
But he turned so quickly.
Well, he turned quickly in a way, and in another way, he didn't turn quickly. What I think you see in the documents and in the other evidence that we have is that Fulbright, from an early point, questioned whether a military solution in Vietnam was ever possible. And he questioned from an early point whether the stakes were really as large as the administration said. So in the early and middle part of 1964, we see William Fulbright expressing these doubts, I think signaling very clearly, not as clearly as he might have arguably, because he was really not willing to do this in any kind of public way, but signaling that he needed to be convinced that this thing was really worth the life of a single American soldier. Then Gulf of Tonkin occurs, and he basically shepherds the resolution through Congress. And Johnson, they've been pretty closely allied. Johnson counts on him to be the person to get the resolution through. Fulbright performs that job admirably, and we can see in the transcripts, to the extent that there was a debate that took place in the Senate, he waves away, more or less, the concerns that some of his colleagues express about what are the implications of giving the president these kinds of powers in Southeast Asia. But again, I think the private Fulbright shares these doubts that these colleagues are expressing. But he agrees to bring this thing through. He does so. I think in 65, he is publicly supportive, privately questioning. And so when there's that split, and it becomes, as you said, a very deep, deep split between the two men, it's not a 180-degree change by Fulbright, because as I said, I think he's now basically voicing the doubts that he's had all the way through. To Johnson, it still is perceived as a betrayal. He begins to refer to Fulbright as Senator Half-Bright, and they have this, as you say, things fall apart completely between them. But the doubts, I guess I'm saying, from Fulbright's side were always there.
Well, it's kind of I think, frustrating about reading the behind-the-scenes stuff, and I think it's probably something that comes to you in the sources that you've looked at, is that there are so many actors in this story that are expressing private reservations the entire time, and yet the story keeps going. As a historian, how do you kind of explain that or mitigate that the tension between those two things? Because you have really a set of people who don't want to go to war going to war.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know that I have a good answer even 25 years after I started researching this. It's certainly one of the main findings in my research, especially for my first book, although I see interesting parallels between the French thinking in this regard in the late 40s and early 50s and the American thinking later. So the French are doing some of the same thing.
Yeah.
Perpetuating a war that they privately think is no longer viable. Maybe it never was, and yet they just keep going year after bloody year. So I do see interesting parallels there. But if we limit this for the moment to the American case, I think one of my main findings in my research is precisely this: that a great many mid-level officials, high senior officials, a great many journalists, intelligence analysts, if you look sort of across the spectrum in a way, informed observers are feeling, at the very least, very deep reservations about whether this thing is going to go well. They know enough about the French experience to know that the problems that the French experienced are likely to come back to haunt them. They also begin to wonder whether this is really as important. This piece of real estate, in geopolitical terms, is really as important as the administrations keep telling us. And yet, as you say,
the ball keeps rolling.
The ball keeps rolling. When they come to a point where they have to make a decision, it's almost always in the direction of deeper U.S. involvement. There are a couple of exceptions. You could say one is in the spring of '54, when there is consideration given to intervening militarily on the side of the French. That doesn't happen. In the fall of '61, John F. Kennedy gets strong urgings from his advisors to commit ground troops to South Vietnam, and he doesn't. But of course he expands the war, the commitment in other respects, in very important ways in '62 and into '63. So, yeah, and I'm still struggling through how one reconciles these positions. I do think that a lot of it has to do, as I suggested earlier, with a feeling that in domestic political terms, and in plain old careerist terms, maintaining the commitment is the smarter thing to do in the short term, or the less painful thing to do in the short term. And that it's easier to say, I'm just going to go in a little more and hope that somehow this will work out, because the alternative, which is to come up now with an explanation that will satisfy critics as to why we're getting out, is just too difficult.
Yeah, and I mean it seems like it makes politics look so dangerous.
Yeah,
to think that, and I mean, when I hear LBJ, the tapes, so much of what he's expressing is I want to do this, but it's impossible. They'll fry me.
Yeah.
The kind of idea that I'm handcuffed by the people in some way.
Oh yeah, yeah, and he'll say, what the hell? What is Vietnam worth to me, and what's it worth to this country? At a different point, he says, I don't think we can win, and I don't think we can get out. That just about sort of summarizes his position. It's true. One could also find LBJ saying all kinds of hawkish things on those tapes. You could find him saying, we have to prevail, and this is crucial. But overall, if you take the evidence in its totality, I think what comes through is a Johnson who is a gloomy, as I've said somewhere or other, he's a gloomy realist, which is partly to his credit, I guess. But it asks actually larger questions about then, well, why did he do what he did? So, very large questions, and troubling ones.
Yeah, I mean, how much do you indulge in counterfactuals when you approach this material? Because it seems like, because you are so focused on kind of locating critical decision points, Does it mean that you often have to consider what would have happened if it had gone, or the possibility if things had gone the other way? And there are certain historians, I won't mention them, but that kind of do that whole counterfactual history and make arguments that the United States could have won, Diem was a good leader, these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I want to, I guess, make some separations because I am among those who believes that counterfactual analysis, when it's carefully done, and when it adheres to a number of, I guess you could call them ground rules, I think actually can have great historical utility. And as you know, there are those in our profession who frown on that notion, who think it's a parlor game, it's a waste of time, and so I disagree. In fact, I think whenever you are interested in causality, by definition, you're on some level interested in, or you're at least engaging in counterfactuals.
Yeah.
In fact, you could say, as in fact has been said, that any time a historian uses the word because, it's an indication that counterfactual analysis is actually at hand. So to vow to say nothing counterfactual can mean to basically vow to say nothing at all. That said, I do think you have to be careful in how you use it. I think what I have found is that I can have a better sense, and for myself at least a better understanding of what did happen through a careful investigation of what might have happened.
Yeah, or what didn't happen.
Or what didn't happen.
Yeah.
And I think, as I've said before, one of my first publications was a long essay that looked at the mother of all counterfactuals, which is the Kennedy counterfactual. Yeah. Suppose he lives, what happens in Vietnam? And I found that exercise very useful for me. We can never know, obviously, what Kennedy would have done. But I think that looking at the large archival record that exists for the Kennedy period, comparing it with the evidence that we have for the period after Dallas, considering that not a lot of other variables change, which is to say that Kennedy's advisors become Johnson's advisors.
Right.
Kennedy's demise is a very sudden demise. He didn't die of a lengthy illness. He died through an assassin's bullet. Lots of reasons why this is actually conducive to careful counterfactual analysis. Also, the amount of time under study is a short time, which I think also helps. Again, it's not going to be foolproof. We're not going to know, obviously, definitively what would have happened. But I think it's one way for me to address, to isolate Johnson's importance and Kennedy's importance too. The importance of individual decision makers. It can be a very good way to grapple with that question.
Yeah. Have you had to deal with kind of, I don't know. There are certain historians that are just kind of over-identify with the goals of the United States, and they kind of internalize those goals. And the Cold War is something that, even though it was, there were many mistakes were made, the Cold War was a project that was one that was, I guess, a positive force. How do you? I mean, I know it's impossible, but how do you kind of stay objective when you're doing this stuff? Because when I read your book, and I get mad. When I read your book, I see all these critical decisions being made by men who are serving politics that are cynical, and that end up getting a lot of people killed. And it's hard not to have an emotional charge to that. Is that something you struggle with when you write and work?
Well, I guess what I would say is that I try to keep it in check.
Yeah.
I don't believe personally, and this is something that each historian has to decide for him or herself, I suppose. I don't try to crush it or to bottle it up in terms of my own approach to my work. And I am deeply troubled, as I suggested earlier, by some of the things that I have come to believe about why the French did what they did and why their American successors did what they did. And of course, it goes without saying that terrible things were done also by the Vietnamese, by the North Vietnamese, by the South Vietnamese, by the Viet Cong, by the Viet Minh. But, my principal work in my career has been really in understanding the American side of this story. And I get angry too. And I think that the conclusions, that the evidence points us in troubling directions. And no doubt it's the case that when you're working on the recent past, as I do, this is more likely to happen than if you're working on a subject that is 1,000 years or 500 years old. Does that mean we should shy away from it as historians? I don't think so. I think it's very important to be engaged in work on the comparatively recent past. This, however, is one potential consequence because it is so close to us, and we have a sense of what, in this case, what the results were coming out of these decisions.
Yeah, and I think we can wrap it up here. I wanted to thank you for your time. I mean, I find your work profoundly insightful, and I think one of the things I like about it is that there is as much as you're writing about these momentous and angering things, there's not a self-righteousness to your language, that you're really kind of very obviously concerned with understanding how these things happened. Yeah. And I just love your work. Thank you so much for talking to me.
I'm grateful for that, and I do want to just say, first of all, thanks to you for approaching me about this and having this conversation. But I think you put your finger on something important, which is that for me, I think for all of us who are historians, but I'll just speak for myself, understanding the past on its own terms, and understanding, in my case, decision makers from the past in their own terms is important. I think ultimately that's, for me, the key consideration, and I think it's important to try to put oneself to be empathetic as a historian.
Yeah.
To try to put yourself in the shoes of these decision makers who went before you and who you're studying, and try to see things from their perspective. However, what is key here is that there were so many people, first for the French and then for the Americans, who at the time expressed these concerns about the direction of the policy, who at the time said, are we sure we want to be doing this? Who at the time said we could pay a huge price in human terms and other terms if we do this. That matters. Yeah. It's not just in hindsight that we see this as being...
It means that we need to honor those voices today. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Frederik Logevall. Great conversation. Thank you.